Hello and welcome to PFI Talks, brought to you by Prague Finance Institute, cooperating with the leading Czech economics research center, Sergej EI. My name is Leos Rusek. I'm the head of corporate communications at PPF Group and the host of this podcast. It is my pleasure to welcome Morgan Housel, the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Psychology of Money, and the most recently published book, The Art of Spending Money, and a former columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He's one of the most influential voices in personal finance, making complex financial concepts easy to understand and relatable. Welcome to PFI Talks.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm gonna be, starting off with my description of you. I mean, what have I missed? Because you seem to be doing a lot of things, but very focused. You know, you're combining finance, investing, psychology, but you're doing it in your own way. So what did I miss in that sort of summary or my attempt at the summary of your curriculum vitae, so to speak?
Yeah, so I think it's sometimes easier for me to explain what I don't do. I don't consider myself a journalist. I'm not a fund manager. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm none of those things. I've never attached those labels to myself. I've always just considered myself someone with a deep interest in investing and as an outside observer. And I think it's important to be an outside observer because, look, there are some downsides in the sense that I'm not in the trenches, so to speak. I'm not working with clients. I'm not a fund manager. So there are perspectives that those professions have that I don't. But I think it's important sometimes, as you were as a journalist, a reporter, to be an outsider because you are not influenced by a lot of the pressures that the insiders are. And so I've always just considered myself someone who sits like a bird in the tree, just observing what's going on below. And I just want to observe not necessarily what people are doing, but what is going through their heads when they're doing it. So I've never been interested in questions like, what is the stock market going to do next? Or what is the economy going to do next? That's never interested me. I've always been very interested in questions like, what is going through people's heads when they make decisions with their investments, when they make decisions with their money? That's always been really fascinating to me. And I kind of felt like there was a little bit of a hole in that in trying to answer those questions when I started doing this almost 20 years ago.
Would that actually mean that you are, when you're looking at investing and when you're actually coming up with your thoughts and insights, you are actually making a distinction between professionals, shall we say those, financial advisors or people with MBA degrees and just regular folks like us, just sort of without that sort of knowledge doing the investment. So you are looking at the group, at the sort of uninitiated and what they do, or are you trying to apply all the data and knowledge that all these MBA holders and professionals in investing know?
See, I really don't make that distinction that much because I think regardless of what your job title is or your profession is or what letters you have after your name, so to speak, the common denominator between novice investors and professional investors is they're all human and their brains work very similarly. And so they're going to have the same propensity by and large for greed and fear and overconfidence and envy and social aspiration. And those are the things that matter more than anything in investing. And so, of course, you can be, and there are many of highly educated MBA professional portfolio managers who lose control over their sense of greed and fear, and they will not do well as investors. There are also many complete novice, uneducated, unexperienced mom and pop individual investors who have a very good grasp on their sense of long-term thinking and greed and fear and accepting volatility, and they will do very well as investors. So it's important to point out that very few fields are like that. You know, it's not like it would be crazy in medicine if someone who was a certified medical doctor did worse at health and performing surgery than a layperson. That would be crazy. That would never happen. Or if a layperson who had no education could build a skyscraper that was stronger than the one built by a professional engineer, that would be crazy. But that example does happen in investing. It does happen with money, where it's not necessarily what you know that matters. It's about how you behave. And I think that was also a hole in finance, particularly academic finance, over the last 50 or 100 years, where it was taught by and large with good intentions by good people that if you only knew the right formulas, and if you had the right data and you understood the concepts, you could do well. And if you didn't have those things, you wouldn't do well. I'm kind of whitewashing that, but that's kind of how it was taught. And I just thought there was so much evidence that it was not like that at all. It's not necessarily to discount the formulas or the data or the charts, but it was none of those things matter until you've mastered your behavior. And until you can figure that out, whether you are a MBA fund manager or a soccer mom who doesn't know anything about investing, nothing else is going to matter.
If I understand you correctly, you think that the whole sort of human behavior is actually the most important factor and driver of investment decisions.
Not only investment decisions, but how we save our money, how we spend our money, our social aspiration, those kind of things. And it's a very rare field that's like that again. There's not many other things that we deal with in life where it is purely a behavioral aspect. I guess one close analogy is our own personal health, where you can be a PhD in biology and understand all of the mechanics and the organic chemistry of like how our bodies work. But if you are an alcoholic and you smoke and you sleep 2 hours a night and you're then none of the knowledge is going to make any difference if you haven't mastered your own behavior to begin with. And I think that's how it is close to all areas of money. I think it's the most important aspect of everything that happens with money is that behavior is always going to trump intelligence.
Well, that's a pretty tough analogy. It's almost dystopian. Analogy between the alcoholic and a sane approach to investment. But I get it. So when we talk about I just want to get down to the sort of behavioral traits. What will be the sort of behavioral traits that you would find the most important and defining in investing, and as well as underrated by the professional investment community? Because you did mention greed and fear. What others would be in that category?
I think one that is very easy to overlook, and it's almost counterintuitive, is the idea that there is not one right way to invest your money. And I think the investing industry has inadvertently, again, by good, honest, noble people, done a lot of damage with the general idea that there is a right way to invest. And if you are not doing it, then you're doing it wrong. And the general idea that if I am investing differently than you are, then one of us is making a mistake. And I think that is by and large not true. That investing is very much an individualistic endeavor. And myself in the country that I live in, and yourself in the country that you live in, and people from different generations and different upbringings and different cultures are going to have very different views on what is an acceptable level of risk to take, on how you should invest, on what your aspirations are. And so I've been very open about how I invest my own money. I dollar cost average into index funds that I hope to own for 50 years. But whenever I say that, I have to go so far out of my way to say, I don't necessarily recommend that you do that. It might be good for you. It might be a disaster. It might be the right advice for other people. It might be the worst advice you could possibly give them. And I think I spent a lot of my career not believing that, not understanding that quite yet. I was closer to the idea that there is a right way to invest. And if you're doing it differently, you're doing it wrong. And I think there is so much more nuance to that. And I think a lot of financial poor decisions, a lot of financial mistakes happen when somebody is following an investing plan or a spending plan that is right for somebody else but wrong for you. And it's a very easy trap to go down because you can look at other people, or your financial advisor will tell you, this is the right way to do it. Look at all these people who have exceeded and excelled doing this strategy, but it's not right for your personality. And so there are things that I do in my household, that my wife and I do with our money, that don't necessarily make sense on a spreadsheet. I can't explain them and say, look, given this academic theory and given these numbers that add up in Excel in my spreadsheet, that's why I do it. They don't make a lot of analytical sense, but they fit my personality. And they might not fit yours. That's the whole point. The whole point is that we're all very different in this endeavor. And I think so that's one of the question you asked was one of the most prominent behavioral biases. And I think it is that. It is the assumption that there is one right way to do it when this is actually an art. This is actually a very individualistic endeavor. Something that I think would be overrated would be the idea that, it's always the case that the biggest economic story and the biggest news story of the next year or the next 5 years is something that nobody is talking about today. It's always been the case that what actually moves the needle the most in hindsight is the surprise, which was COVID-19 that nobody saw coming. It was 9/11, the terrorist attack. It was Pearl Harbor that dragged the United States into World War II. Those kind of events, their common denominator is not that they were big, it's that they were unforeseen by virtually everyone. They were unforeseeable. And so I think the idea that gets too much attention in finance is that if we crunch enough data and talk to enough smart people and get enough visionaries giving us their outlook, we can have a 12-month outlook, a 12-month forecast that's going to give us any reasonable idea of what the actual biggest risks are in our future.
So, in other words, we can all probably agree on some sort of a rate of return that will be acceptable for both of us, but the approaches to achieve that may not necessarily be akin. Is that what you say?
Yeah, I think that's true, but it's even more nuanced than that. There's a great story from Daniel Kahneman, the late psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics. And he told this story about 10 years ago. He said he went to a financial advisor. And at the time, I'm guessing he was like late 70s, around that age. And he said, I have no desire to ever make more money than I have right now. I have no desire to ever see my net worth higher than it is right now. I just want to live out my days on this little pot of money that I've saved, and that's all I want to do. And he said the financial advisor told him, I cannot work with you. Because to her, to the financial advisor, it was insane that somebody would not want more money. She couldn't understand it. And Kahneman told the story as like he was very curious about that idea, that people would not want more money. And so to a lot of people, the goal of investing is to absolutely maximize returns. That's the entire reason they wake up in the morning, is to earn the highest return that they can. To another people on the other end of the spectrum, there's people like Kahneman who are like, I literally don't want another penny to my name. And don't risk a single penny of this. I listened to this podcast last week with Jay Leno, who's a famous talk show host in the United States. And he said the same thing. He said for his entire adult life, he's gone to his financial advisor and he's like, look, the purpose of this money is to make sure that I don't have less next year. If I ever come to you, Mr. Financial Advisor, and there's less money that I had the year before, you have failed. So he's like, he's basically saying, don't take any risk whatsoever. I'm fine if I just earn a 2% return. I never want to see this go down. So he was virtually the same. And so the idea that, there is a target rate of return in the market. And of course, if we're talking to academic finances people, they would say, look, that's consistent with what they believe too. There's a risk spectrum of how much risk and return you want to take. But I think people get into a lot of damage and into a lot of trouble in finance when they assume that, given my age and given my income, I should be targeting X% per year, when actually the range of the spectrum of what people are willing to put up with in terms of volatility and risk and what they actually aspire to in terms of the returns and the wealth they're trying to build, there's a vast difference in those things. Yeah.
Well, thanks for mentioning Daniel Kahneman, because we're very happy having him actually here at Prague Finance Institute at this podcast in 2022. Not so long before his passing. And my next question is because, talking to him at that time, he spent explaining to us in many different ways. So, I'm not an economist. There is this label that they've put on me that I do behavioral economics. I'm a psychologist. And of course, I've thought about it and, a lot since then. But I think you are following in his footsteps. Would that be a right description of what you do? Well,
I don't think anyone will follow in his footsteps, so to speak. I think he was the most influential psychologist since probably Sigmund Freud. But I think the idea, and he was, I don't think he sought this out, but he is, as you mentioned, is a psychologist, but became the most influential economist of his era. I don't think that's an exaggeration. But I think that
he kept refusing that label, which is very interesting.
Yes. Here's, and I don't want to put words in his mouth. He's passed away now, but I think the idea that finance is an unbelievably clear window into people's psychology, because how you think about money and aspiration and risk is a very clear insight into your soul, into who you are. And other things in your life that are also a good insight into who you are, like your personal relationships with your spouse and things like that. Most people are kind of walled off. Like, that's my personal life. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to show anybody. But with money, there is almost like a peacocking effect of you want people to see your house, your car, your clothes. You want them to know how successful you are, or you are ashamed of how unsuccessful you are. And so it is a very clear window into how people think about their own psychology and the psychology of others. And I think inadvertently, people like Kahneman were attracted to that, even if their entire aspiration was just understanding psychology.
I want to touch on one of the things that you mentioned in your most famous book, The Psychology of Money, and I'm just going to read it out. That you were sort of saying that the hardest financial skill is getting the goalpost stop moving.
Yeah, it's this idea that I think most people.
I think I understand it, but can you describe it for the benefit of our listeners? What exactly do you mean by that?
I think most people have experienced this and will recognize it when I say it, that it is easy to tell yourself, oh, once I have X dollars, once my income, my salary, my net worth is X, whatever X might be, then I'll be happy. Then I'll be satisfied. And then if you are fortunate enough to get there, then it becomes, well, maybe if I had 2X, then I'd be happy. And then you get there. Maybe it's always the gaze of your aspiration is never satiated. You're always just moving on to the next mountain, the next level. And so the idea that like you can, if you are young, you tell yourself, man, if I had $1 million, that's all I'd ever need. I'd be happy forever. And some people can do that. What's way more common is if you get to $1 million, you're like, actually, I think 5 million is the amount that I would need. And then there've been several academic studies that have shown this, that basically if you ask people, how much money would you need to be happy? No matter how much money you make or what your net worth is today, the answer that most people will give you is about two times what I have today. And that is true whether you make $50,000 per year or $10 million per year. The amount that you think will satiate you is double whatever you're earning right now. And so that's the idea of if your expectations are always growing as fast or even faster than your income, you will never be satisfied with what you have. And I think when people daydream about having more money, having a bigger house, being in retirement, those kind of things, when they daydream about that and those daydreams feel good, by and large, what you are anticipating when you have those daydreams is having that house, car, retirement, and being satisfied with it. Like waking up and saying, this is all I need. I don't need anything else. I don't aspire for anything else. And that's what feels good. Satisfaction and contentment is what feels great. But what is way more common in a competitive world are people who get to that level and say, I want more. I need more. It's always important for me to point out that I want to live in that world because that is the root of all progress. It is a root of all progress and innovation that most people wake up every morning, regardless of how much material success they have, and they say, this is not enough. We need more. We need more efficient products. We need better innovation. We need better medical technology. That's the root of all progress. And so this is not a bad thing at all. But at the individual level, you can see why it is possible to double your income, triple your income, 10x your income, and not feel any better for it. If your expectations are rising in lockstep with your income, you will never be satisfied with what you have. And then you realize that, yes, I want a higher income. I want a higher net worth, but I have to go out of my way to manage my expectations with as much emphasis as I do improving my circumstances.
But don't you, in this view, in this respect, underrate the sort of a thrill of actually getting to that double X? You know, maybe someone is actually just looking for the thrill of that journey, how to get there, rather than achieving that goalpost.
I think I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. That what people like is growth, not necessarily getting to a spot. Will Smith, the great actor, phrased this in a very smart way, I thought, with fame. He said, becoming famous is the best feeling in the world. Being famous is okay at best. And losing fame is the worst feeling that you can imagine. And so inherent in that is like what feels good is the change. What feels good is the growth. But actually getting to a level doesn't really do that much for you because you're just thinking about the next change, the next level up. And so that's why it's very common, and it's not even a bad thing for us to have financial goals. Oh, it would be great if my income could grow by this much. It would be great if my net worth was this much. Those are great, but we massively overestimate what it's going to do for our well-being.
Well, your latest book, The Art of Spending Money, and I'm not going to read the subtitle or pretend that I actually have memorized it, sort of feels like a sequel to your bestseller. I mean, is it the right way of looking at it, or should we expect, usually there are, everything good comes in three, as the saying goes, so to speak. I mean, is there going to be a trilogy of these books, or?
I have a good friend who explained this to me. He said it's not so much the sequel as it is the completion of The Psychology of Money. Now, those are similar things, but they're actually different things. The Psychology of Money is very much about the psychology of growing wealth and building wealth. And that was really important to me. And, the psychology of investing. But I realized that, 3 or 4 years ago, if you asked me, to explain my psychology of investing, I could talk to you for hours. I could talk to you for hours about my psychology of investing. But then I asked myself one day, I said, what is my and my wife's psychology of spending? And I didn't really know. I hadn't really thought about it much at all. And I also realized that there are literally tens of thousands of books written about how to grow your wealth. And there were virtually none about what to do with your wealth, about how to spend it. And I think part of that reason is because I think a lot of people naturally assume that nothing needs to be said about this topic. That the idea of like needing advice on how to spend your money seems crazy, that you just go out and spend it and like you spend more and that's better and that's the end of the story. But I think if you like observe other people, you'll see that there is a huge difference in the amount of satisfaction that people get out of the money that they have. There are some people who do not earn very much who have gotten a lot out of their money. They have really used it as a tool and as a lever to live a better life. And there are also a lot of people who make tons of money who are completely beholden to their money. The money was in complete control over their personality. It told them who they could be, where they could live, what they could do. And those people got very little out of their money. Their money was a financial asset, but it was a psychological liability that controlled their personality, and they didn't get much happiness or contentment out of it.
So it's almost like a sort of a life cycle, sort of a life coaching book. So maybe the psychology of money is really for sort of the younger generation, someone who's actually trying to, juggle paying a mortgage, starting a family, paying off student loans, and actually, building some sort of a foundation for his or her future well-being in terms of capital. While the art of spending money is for an older generation. Okay, now how you approach that when you've achieved something that you've set out to achieve. So, what will be your advice through the prism of your books, of these two books, to someone who I just described, the young person who's just sort of like getting into that rigmarole of juggling the family, building family wealth and etc.
I think in both books, I don't give you any advice on how to invest your money or how to spend your money, because again, I don't know you. We're all very different. And so I think to a young person in particular, that can be hard to accept. Most young people, particularly in a book that might be labeled self-help, even though I've never put that label on any of the stuff that I do for myself, that people want a formula. Just tell me how to do it. Just tell me how to invest. Just tell me how to spend. And I don't do any of that here. And so I think the advice to a young person is you really have to spend a lot of time not looking for answers, but looking in the mirror, so to speak, and becoming more introspective about your own personality, your own skills and flaws that we all have, and trying to figure out what makes you happy. And using money as a tool to live a better life, not necessarily as a yardstick of status to measure yourself against others by. I think particularly for young people, when you're trying to establish yourself in the world, and you're trying to establish yourself on the social hierarchy of competing with other people during a time in your life when you might not have a lot of money, a lot of job skills, you're still learning about yourself and learning about how the world works, it's very easy for that young generation to say, if only I had more money, then things would be better, because I would insert myself higher on a higher peg on the social hierarchy. And I think it's too easy to overestimate how true that can be. And so a lot of people, as they age and have more life experience, will realize that yes, money can be great. You can use money to live a great life, but it's not what matters the most. What matters by far are your relationships, your health, the own philosophy that you have, your conscience, like how well you sleep at night, that kind of thing. And so if you can use money as a tool to leverage those things, fantastic. If you can use money to leverage your relationships and spend time with the people that you want and live where you want and have good health and work in a company that you admire for people who you admire, that's great. That's awesome. But the knee-jerk reaction, particularly for young people, is how can I use money as a social status yardstick to insert myself at a higher level than everybody else?
Well, for some, maybe, and not necessarily the young generation, there is this concept of financial freedom. And in your view, would you agree that financial freedom is really about, they are looking at it as a sort of an escape hatch from a daily routine of having to go to work, 9 to 5 jobs, or even more, or longer shifts or everything else, or now actually going back to the offices from working from home. Do you think that financial freedom, is rooted in having more money or needing less?
I think what's important is that financial independence exists on a spectrum. And so if your definition of financially independent is you don't need to work anymore, that is one level of independence, but there is a lot of independence that exists below that. And so the way I view it is when I save money, I'm not necessarily, I don't view it as saving money. I view it as purchasing independence. I view it as every dollar that I save is a piece of my future that I own in that, a piece of my time that I own in the future. And what's important is that if you save $100, $1,000, whatever it might be, small amounts of money, that gives you more independence than you had before that. And so a lot of people will say, look, the idea of independence is completely out of the question for me, because they define independence as you don't need to work anymore. I think independence is a broadening of the range of outcomes that you can endure in a volatile and unpredictable world. So if you were to be laid off from your job, having $100, €100 in the bank makes you more independent than you were before. It gives you a little bit more breathing room to make decisions on your own terms. And every dollar, every euro, every €1,000 that you save above that gives you a little bit more independence. So I think independence is the highest purpose that money can serve. It's a wonderful thing. But I think it's important to recast the definition of by independent, I don't mean you don't need to work. I just mean that you can absorb and manage a broader range of outcomes in a volatile world.
When it comes to our personal decisions regarding money, do we run into limits of our, cognitive abilities, or are we just really shaped by whatever we see around us, whatever environment, whatever we see, whatever car we see our neighbor is driving? I mean, is that the impact of environment, sort of external factors, or is it our inability or ability to make rational or appropriate decisions?
I think we are extremely influenced by our environment, but I would also say that by environment, the most important environment that we are influenced by is the past environments that we've lived. It's our lived experiences. It's not necessarily what we have today. It's the fact that we have been so shaped and melded by the lives that we have lived up until now. And so it is so true that if you grew up poor and you were snubbed as a child and people ridiculed you for your poor and you were embarrassed and shamed for being poor, by and large, on average, those people, if they grow up as adults to have money, will want to show off that money. Those are the people who want you to see their car, their clothes, their house, their jewelry, because it's like they are trying to heal a social wound that was inflicted upon them when they were children. And I think we all have some version of that our level of confidence or lack of confidence, that our willingness, our desire to show off or not show off, to be humble, is so shaped by the experiences that we've had up until now. And it's easy to be blinded by those, because I think if people think about being influenced by their environment, it's the environment of today. But so much of our ability to want to climb the social ladder is not even to show off to other people or to perform for other people. It's to prove to yourself, like to heal an emotional wound that you had, and to prove to yourself that, like, oh, I used to be over here, but now I grew and saved my money, and now I have this house, and that makes you feel good. It's a trophy for yourself. And so I think the idea that we are so influenced by the lives that we have lived, and of course, my life has been very different from yours and different from everyone listening to this. We're all very different people. My life is very different from my own siblings. We grew up in the same house. And so the fact that we are all shaped by our past and our pasts are so unique to us is a very important point in finance.
So in today's world, is it sort of like accentuated because of the social media and everything is on display, that there are so many examples that actually people can see, and and not necessarily just young generations, that they can get images and sort of examples how to compare their lifestyles to someone else's lifestyle. Is it somehow different in this sort of like social media, always on type of an environment, more accentuated than what it used to be?
Yeah, I mean, it's enormous, because it used to be in the past, and when I say past, I mean like 10 years ago, that you compared yourself and you compared your well-being to your neighbors and your coworkers and people in your town, and that was it. And maybe there's some people on TV and in magazines that you could compare yourself to, but by and large, you knew that they were celebrities. If you were comparing yourself to people on TV, by and large, they're not like you. But today with social media, it is an literally endless display of people who, A, are supposed to be peers. These are not celebrities. These are not athletes. These are people who are ostensibly your peers, who are putting on a daily performance on social media of how successful, happy, rich they are. And it is a performance. People don't go on social media to communicate. They go on social media to perform for each other. And because of that, it is easy to overestimate how well other people are doing and underestimate how well you are doing. Montesquieu said this 300 years ago, whenever he was alive. He said, if you only want to be happy, that is very easy to achieve. But people want to be happier than other people. And that is difficult because we overestimate how happy other people are. And he said that hundreds of years ago, back in his day. In the social media day, it is that on steroids. It is that times 10 because you're comparing yourself to a limitless display of people who we think are peers who are just performing their faux happiness, faux success, faux beauty.
I have a question related to this professional community of financial advisors or analysts, because I remember reading in one of your columns that you are, and correct me if I'm trying to sort of re-say it, what you wrote incorrectly, but you said that most of these analysts today, they are actually talking over each other rather than communicating at the same level, so I can get the right as a user of that information, so I can make my own decision.
Yeah, so for example, if you're watching CNBC, you're watching financial television, and there's an analyst who comes on and says, I'm just making this up, you should buy Microsoft stock before earnings. They say something like that. I always want to be like, well, who are you talking to? Are you talking to a pension fund with a 100-year history? Are you talking to a 17-year-old day trader? And because let's not pretend the advice is going to be the same for them. And so a lot of times when we disagree with each other about how to invest or how to save, we're not actually arguing. We're not actually debating. We just kind of, without even knowing it, we get upset that people have different views and values and goals than we do. Because it gets back to what we talked about earlier, the idea that there should be one right answer, that money should be like it's math. And in math, it doesn't matter how old you are or where you live, there is one right answer. 2 + 2 always equals 4. And I think when we experience the opposite of that in finance, where everyone's going to come up with a different answer that fits for them, it can make us pretty cynical and argumentative. When if I hear you say something about the stock market and how you invest, if it's not how I invest, it's easy for me to say, you must be wrong. And vice versa. So I think most financial debates are not actually disagreements. It's people with different time horizons, different risk tolerances, different cultural experiences and expectations who are inadvertently talking over each other.
Well, and isn't that the sort of a endorsement of actually moving all the investment to quants and letting computers do the work for us?
It's certainly moving in that direction. But I mean, it's interesting to ask, how many human decisions would you need in the stock market for it to be very volatile, for human emotion to still play a role, for humans to actually be the price setters and not the quants? And I think the answer is not that much. Even if you got to a market where it was only like 5% were individual investors with their human emotions making buy-sell decisions, you still have a very volatile market. So even in that world where it's like the quants, the computers are just coldly, rationally calculating stock prices, you still have plenty of volatility.
I can't help it, but I have to ask you, what's your take on today's stock market? I know we don't give advice, but I mean, if you can sort of like look at it through the prism of your books, I mean, we've seen a very long period of tech-driven now, AI tech-driven boom, but also, persistent inflationary pressures, high cost of living. So where do you see the stock market today and where do you see it going? And do you anticipate or do you see that we are in a bubble? Or would you agree with that argument?
What's interesting is that if you ask me how I feel today, I would agree with everything you just said. The stock market looks very expensive. There's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of leverage. There's a lot of complacency. Absolutely. What is also true, and I think more important, is I've been following the stock market for 21, 22 years. At virtually every moment over the last 22 years, I would have said the same thing. If you asked me in 2005 or 2011 or 2016, I would have told you the exact same thing. Stock market looks expensive, a lot of complacency. People have done very well. It's the same argument always. And what has the stock market done in the last 22 years in the United States? It's up like 4-fold, 5-fold, something like that. And so even if I were to honestly tell you that I think the stock market is very expensive and probably not a good bargain today, I would have told you the same thing 10 years ago. And so the idea, I think it's not a plea for anything other than humility. That even if we try to analyze what is going on in the world, the idea that we therefore know what's going to happen next is always the flawed argument. And also over the last 22 years, when I would have told you the stock market was overvalued most of the time, been a lot of volatility, of course. There have been multiple crashes, several recessions, uncountable number of 5 and 10% pullbacks and declines. And so I think that's the whole history of investing. It never looks easy. There is never a time in investing when everyone looks around and says, "This is great. This is the perfect valuation. Everyone is acting, is behaving and doing the right thing." That never exists. It either looks like we are, at every point in time from the last 22 years that I've been doing this, it always looks like there's a recession right around the corner. Hyperinflation is right around the corner. The stock market is too expensive. Politicians are making mistakes. Central banks are making mistakes. There's never been a moment when those things did not look true. And so if I say it looks like that today, the asterisk is same as it ever was.
Sort of hearkening back to the title of one of your books, Same as Ever,
You got it. Yep.
Well, it's been my pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
This has been so much fun.